What is your assessment of Syria saying they would accept Russia's proposal, which came out after Secretary of State Kerry's seemingly offhand remark, although it looks like President Obama said he's now discussed this with Russian President Vladimir Putin, putting chemical weapons, Syria putting their chemical weapons under international control?
Well, certainly that's a welcome move, but I think it's a stall tactic. Let's keep in mind that just last night, Bashar al-Assad refused to confirm or deny that his regime actually possesses chemical weapons. So apparently this is an admission that they do possess them. And I'm reminded of other international initiatives like the Kofi Annan Plans 1 and 2 and the Lakhdar Brahimi UN plan, where the Assad regime agreed to pull back tanks from civilian areas and then failed to do so. So I'm not sure this really has any teeth.
And your response, Rania Masri, of these latest fast-moving developments as President Obama is expected to address the nation tonight, and he was expected to make a push for war to a majority unconvinced country, the people of the United States.
Yes, well, I think it strongly reveals both President Obama's international isolation, with his only main ally supporting a bombing campaign against Syria being the Saudis, who have themselves funded many of these so-called rebels in Syria. And at the same time, President Obama is facing increasing domestic opposition from the Republicans to the Democrats across the political spectrum. What I see coming out of Russia actually is proof of the power of political settlements and of the importance of diplomacy, given the horrendous consequences of a bombing campaign on Syria, and particularly on the Syrian people, and giving the extraordinary need for a political settlement. This demonstration by the Russian government and the Syrian government shows a strong possibility towards the power of a political settlement. And I think it also reveals a great deal that those who claim to speak on behalf of the Syrian people here in the United States, be it either the Syrian National Coalition or the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, any of these so-called opposition forces here in the U.S., how they have been so adamant to support a bombing campaign against their own country. And yet when we look into who they are, we see that they are actually puppets representing Saudi Arabia much more than they represent the people of Syria.
Let's get a response to that from Rafif Jouejati. Your assessment of Rania's statement that exiled Syrian groups are unfairly backing a bombing campaign.
I think many in the Syrian expatriate communities certainly do favor a military strike. This is not because they are puppets of the Saudi government, as Rania says. This is not because they don't represent the Syrian people. I believe this is because many, many Syrians inside Syria, not in the United States, but inside Syria, feel that Assad will not stop unless he is stopped militarily. This is the man who is responsible for the deaths of more than 100,000 civilians. This is the regime that is responsible for the internal displacement of at least 4 million people, 2 million refugees abroad. So Syrians who are inside are feeling that there is no hope but for a military strike.
Actually, if I can respond to that, if I may. I did not claim that the Syrian expat community in the United States were puppets. I specifically said that those who claim to represent the Syrian National Council and the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary Forces are, be they George Sabra, who has gone on record as supporting Samir Jaja, a right-wing fascist and an ally of Israel, or Ahmed al-Jarba, who is a known convicted drug dealer and who is a strong supporter of the Saudis. This is clear. As for your number of 100,000, again, it falls into this very detrimental binary. We're very familiar with the crimes of the Syrian regime. However, to present it that the Syrian regimes are the only ones right now in Syria that are committing crimes of atrocity is false, and it's not even supported by the pro-opposition Syrian Human Rights Observatory. And they themselves, this pro-opposition Syrian Human Rights Observatory, recognizes that 43% of that figure of 100,000 fatalities, 43% of them are Syrian army combatants. And when we look at these rebel groups in Syria, we understand, even according to Secretary of State John Kerry, that 15 to 20% of them are known terrorists with affiliates to Al-Qaeda or worse, and that the others, the so-called Free Syrian Army, actually work with Al-Qaeda, as numerous statements from these so-called Free Syrian Army battalions have revealed, including this latest atrocity of the attack against Ma'lula, one of the most ancient Christian villages in the world. We have this attack against Ma'lula, which in no way can be regarded as an attack against a Syrian army strong post. It can only be seen what it is, an attack against Christians Christians, because many of whom that are leading this armed fight against the Syrian regime are unfortunately takfiris. What is lost throughout all this binary presentation is the people of Syria themselves, the non-violent civil society movements within Syria. The people of Syria themselves, they are the ones caught between the Syrian regime and the Free Syrian Army and Al-Qaeda. And unfortunately, it is their voices that are being lost, and it is their voices that we hear through numerous networks that have continued to say no to a bombing campaign, no to military intervention, yes to political negotiations, yes to humanitarian aid.
Your response, Rafiq.
Can I respond to that? Because there are so many points that got convoluted in that statement. First of all, it's not the so-called Free Syrian Army. It is actually called the Free Syrian Army, which is a largely secular group. Certainly no one is disputing the presence of Islamists, foreign jihadists in the country, but we recognize that these are a minority, and we recognize that Syrian civilians across the country have come out in protest against them, saying we will not trade one dictatorship for another. Second of all, I do represent the nonviolent community, the civil society community that is on the ground in Syria. The local coordination committees has been documenting the deaths of the 100,000 plus civilian casualties. We also document the atrocities committed by members of the armed opposition. So I'm not excusing those, and I'm not saying there's a binary argument here. We do say yes to humanitarian aid. We do say yes to stop the killing. But the LCC has said, if the international community is going to do something, let it stop the murderer, let it stop the massacres, let it stop the bombing campaigns against civilian communities, whether these campaigns are done via Scud missile, whether they're done via barrel bombs at civilian bread lines in Aleppo, for example.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. And then another 9/11. It's September 11th, 1973, the day Salvador Allende was died in the palace in Santiago, Chile, as the Pinochet forces rose to power. We'll speak with one of the last men with him who survived, Juan Garces, his closest advisor. We're speaking with Rafiq Jouajeti, Syrian local coordination committees, and Rania Masri, a professor in Lebanon, speaking to us from North Carolina. Stay with us.
For the free people in the world, your right shoulder, do your fist in the sky if you feel it. Your left shoulder, ha, company. Ain't about your guns on wet, hellfire, spitting, burn up everything they hitting. Some do they job to dodge the barrage that sleep projectiles, devastate miles. Firefight invades the night with light, loud. But a plane shower, shell rain, demon shot and kill crops on the terrain, and leave any grain that may remain sane. You goddamn right this war gone too far. Soon as mistakes, they're gone first for the stars. Wartime mind find the beauty in the star. High level with death, even beneath radar. High level with death, even beneath radar. High level with death, cause she got pretty eyes. Nobody told me that was so damn fine. I go to sleep with that girl on my mind. Wake up and I see her on the firing line. I grab my heat and it's get downtown. One day I'ma make that girl no mine, but for now I'm a soldier. Ride my time, where I'm a rhyme, a high enemy line. Philistine goes the road cash, man. No different than the avenue that's right here. The increase in the murder rate each
Yassine Bey here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. In his comments on Monday in London, Secretary of State John Kerry said the U.S. is not seeking war in Syria, just what he called an unbelievably small campaign of targeted strikes.
Hold Bashar al-Assad accountable without engaging in troops on the ground or any other prolonged kind of effort, in a very limited, very targeted, very short-term effort that degrades his capacity to deliver chemical weapons without assuming responsibility for Syria's civil war. That is exactly what we're talking about doing. Unbelievably small, limited kind of effort.
Unbelievably small, Rania Masri, professor in Lebanon, speaking to us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Does that reassure you as a person who is opposed to a U.S. strike on Syria? What could it mean?
Well, I think it's more important when we look at what has been discussed by Senator John McCain and others, and they were more talking about a 60 to 90-day bombing campaign, and even a relatively small. And what does that mean? What are the targets that they're going to consider suitable targets for their objectives, given that militarily there cannot be deterrence for the use of chemical weapons militarily, it can only be achieved politically. But I do want to say this in rebuttal to an earlier comment. I do say the so-called Free Syrian Army because it is not an army with a clear hierarchy. It is a group of independent battalions operating under the same name. Check the reports from The Economist, check the reports from Joshua Landis. I think what's absolutely clear, we're all united that we want to stop the violence in Syria. We're all united that we want to have some semblance of peace and stability. And to do that, there needs to be pressure put on all sides in Syria, not only pressure put on the Syrian government, but pressure put on all the rebels themselves who are also committing crimes, if not working directly with the terrorists. And I think it's very important to recognize that the main financier here of these rebel brigades in Syria is Bandar bin Sultan, the previous U.S. ambassador, the previous Saudi ambassador to the United States, and he was also the prime financier of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and of the Contras in Nicaragua. This is a man with a very long track record of encouraging groups to commit crimes and to commit war crimes. And this is not a man who has supported groups that represent the people themselves. So we need to put this into perspective. And I also think that what's happening right now forces the administration and forces those in Congress to come clean. If they are concerned with chemical weapons, they have a way out very clearly without any bombs being dropped. If they are concerned with regime change in Syria, then we will see their position. And again, we all know what the U.S. means when it says regime change. It never does regime change for democracy. It does regime change for implementation of different puppets.
Rafeef Shwaighati, your response to Rania Masri, and on this issue of Saudi backing, among others, Wall Street Journal had a major expose on what Rania Masri was just saying, that the man in the U.S. who came to be known as Bandar Bush, the former Saudi ambassador to the United States, who famously shared a cigar with President Bush the day after the 9/11 attacks on the Truman balcony, so close to the Bush family, they nicknamed him that, that he, in the last few years, is behind much of the support of the Saudi rebels and has been pushing the U.S. to wage a military strike against the Assad regime.
I'm not going to apologize for Bandar bin Sultan. I'm not going to comment or support in any way any of the Gulf involvement in what is happening in Syria. I do want to go back to something Rania said. I do not read Joshua Landis because I make it a practice to not support regime shills and regime propaganda. So if that's the literature she's relying on for her information, that's really unfortunate. But let me go on and answer the specific question you asked, Amy, and that was about John Kerry's statements and I guess sort of the movement of this very limited strike. And let me be clear, the LCC does not support a limited strike. As John Kerry said, this would be unbelievably small, and we don't believe that an unbelievably small response is going to do anything to an unbelievably brutal dictator that is destroying the country, that is destroying civil society, that in fact has been the one to open the doors for the jihadists, that in fact is the one using chemical weapons against its own civilians.
You know,
let me ask you something, Rafeef. Rania Masri, just one second. I want to ask Rafeef, if war was not on the table, I mean, if a U.S. strike was not on the table, what do you think is a diplomatic solution to this incredibly bloody conflict?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure there is a clear-cut answer. We have a fundamental problem in that one of the parties that consistently vetoes any language in the UN also supplies weapons to the Assad regime. This is a major problem. We have the problem of Gulf countries supplying weapons to haphazard battalions on the ground, independent of the Free Syrian Army. So I'm not sure what the diplomatic answer is. The other thing to consider is that, as I began with, 18 months ago, when there were international initiatives, diplomatic initiatives on the table to stop the violence, the Assad regime failed to adhere to a single tenet of the peace plans that were put forward. So we always welcome a diplomatic solution. Of course, this should be a political resolution. But how?
Well, Rania Masri, what about this issue? What do you think is a possible solution?
Well, first I want to say I find it not only criminal but also ahistoric to imagine that a U.S. bombing campaign lobbied against Syria or any other country would actually result in something humanitarian or something peaceful or something stable. Simply study history. Start with studying history.
That's
look at Iraq.
look at
no, let me finish. Look at Iraq. Look at Afghanistan. Look at all others. I find it absolutely abhorrent that we would actually be calling for a larger than a limited military strike on Syria. One. Part two, we need to recognize, and I have to continue to repeating this, yes, the Syrian army has committed crimes, but so has the so-called Free Syrian Army and the terrorists that they work with. And don't just quote me on that or Joshua Landis, but quote the United Nations. When we have a UN independent panel that was released, they released a report earlier this year in which they said, and I quote, "It's impossible to choose good guys among the groups of Syrian rebels and send weapons to them." I think we need to stand clear here and say no to violence committed by any party. And to do that, there is a very strong political solution. The United States can put pressure on its allies in the region, namely the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks, to halt the flood of weapons that's coming in from Sudan and Libya via Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan to these rebels. Halt that. Push the Russians to then put pressure on the Syrians. Get the Syrians themselves to the negotiating table. We all agree that the only solution can be a political settlement. Kerry has said so. Secretary of Defense Hagel had said so. Any bombing campaign will only result in reducing whatever political capital there is, and providing that political settlement will only give power to extremism on all sides in Syria and will only kill more and more Syrians and result in more and more displacement. This is what we need to be calling for: a halt to the arms trade, stronger demand for political diplomacy, for political negotiations, increased support for humanitarian support for the Syrians, and absolutely no bombing of any kind, limited or expanded.
I want to just read this latest from CBS. The French foreign minister has said France will float a resolution at the UN Security Council aimed at forcing Syria to make public its chemical weapons program, place it under international control and dismantle it. It was unclear whether France's fresh push for a UN resolution was spawned by the Russian proposal, but the terms given seem similar. CBS is also reporting Laurent Fabius said France, a permanent member of the 15-nation UN body, would start the resolution process today. He said the proposal would be under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which would back up the resolution with a threat of force if not applied, and would condemn a chemical weapons attack in Syria on August 21st. So let's bring this full circle to where we began. Rafeef, with this latest news, do you see any hope?
You know, I always have to have hope because the people on the ground always have hope. I do want to point out to Rania that she's trying to create a debate where none exists. I'm not defending crimes perpetrated by the opposition, and I'm not condoning in any way any of their negative actions. But to come full circle, the point of a political resolution is to hope that the regime, the perpetrator of the majority of the crimes, would come to that political resolution. And I don't think the Assad regime is capable or willing to engage in any sort of political resolution that has it negotiating itself out of power.
Rania Masri, I wanted to ask you about the comments of Alon Pincus. He's the former Israeli consul general in New York. And speaking to the New York Times last week, Pincus described his take on how Israel is viewing the conflict in Syria. He said, quote, "This is a playoff situation in which you need both teams to lose, but at least you don't want one to win. We'll settle for a tie. Let them both bleed, hemorrhage to death. That's the thinking here. As long as this lingers, there's no real threat from Syria." Are you worried that that is basically the international approach to Syria right now, is let them bleed?
Well, I mean, I take issue with the term international because we do have very different state parties here. I think it is one of the objectives of the U.S. government, yes, and of course its allies, be they in Israel or be they in the Gulf, that yes, one of the objectives is to continue to have them, quote, kill each other, as was the objective of the U.S. government during the Iraq-Iran war. Yes, I do see that as being one of the objectives, the continuous destruction of Syria as a country and of its people on all sides, yes. But I also want to raise this issue. And I'm not just creating a debate for the objective of debate, but I'm actually understanding what's being said by the other party. While we sit here and we're opposed to the use of chemical weapons, and I would argue opposed to the use of all weapons, not just chemical weapons, it's important to point out that according to statements made by the United Nations itself, they've released statements that, quote, they have strong suspicion that the rebels themselves have access and have used sarin gas. And these statements were made earlier this year. So again, I just want to say that what we need to be working on is a full halt of the arms trade. Now, with regards to the French proposal, one thing that scares me as an expert to what the United States did to Iraq during the 13 years of sanctions is once we make a statement related to weapons of mass destruction, any way, shape, or form, and we back it up with a threat of weapons and a threat of a bombing campaign, okay, or a threat of further economic sanctions, we know who will end up getting punished by these. And the people that will end up being punished are the people that have no voice and that are completely vulnerable, and that are the Syrian people itself. So with regards to this resolution that the French are proposing in the United Nations, I think it is wise, so long as it is not backed up by a threat of a bombing campaign. Again, we need to be unequivocal here and say absolutely no bombing campaign by anyone under any circumstances.